because although your own practice is very far away in some ways from participation, I wonder how you feel having experienced that. I think in the ways that we're talking about this direct participation of other people. Yeah, I think there's a research base to it, which is different from the kind of opening a bar and having people having a drink there. I think you've never done that.
What? No, I mean.
Well, maybe you should answer my question in the negative then. That you are involved in participation, and therefore, what are the ethics of that participation? How do you feel about this question of the ethical position of the artist engaging? I mean, in a sense, engaging with the social other, and then at what point does the ethical question of whether you, I guess, abandon them, leave them, transform them? What are the ethics that are around that for you? Not only as an artist, but also as an observer of art, I think, which you are.
Okay, these are many questions all wrapped up in one. First, to the sociology. So, we had many different contacts with the field of art sociology through the University of Lüneburg, through Bourdieu, through many others. And Sabet mentioned the games, fights, and collaborations. 1994 Lüneburg meeting that was initiated by Helmut Draxler and Andrea Fraser that brought together Fred Wilson and many Julie Ault, many Renate Lorenz, many of the people present here today. And then I went on to collaborate with Ulf Wogenig on different shows. And in recent, participation, who's the author? For instance, we were running a project, the last 3 years, 2005 to 2008, in New York, called Orchard, where we were not allowed to call ourselves curating a show, but organizing a show. And before that, in the 90s, we had a group called Parasite, where we would occupy existing institutions to run seminars, discussions, even mount shows. And that was then very strange, because people who were non-artists were not allowed, or art historians and critics were not allowed in. And that term, Parasite, was like project-based artists. And we were like negotiating contracts, and we were thinking of maybe as artists we don't need galleries anymore, but maybe like Magnum photographers, like an agency, like if you have commissions, if that was the time of the kind of service-based art, but now we went from the service economy to the experience economy. And so the 2005 to 2008, I did, for instance, a show called Around the Corner, where in our Lower East Side space, which of course was very much inspired by group material and many other activities of people present here, we were of course trying to learn from the mistakes and trying to build upon all the long histories. And basically there I tried to bring the people out after having invited Zoe Leonard and Peter Wunderlich to kind of show their photographs and works and install an installation into the window and bring them into the streets where these two female artists had taken their photos. And in the kind of participatory way, the people who came onto my tours, they were giving the tour with me because they knew much more than me. So it was a kind of collaborative thing. I was just preventing the event where people could exchange stories. But I don't know if that answers your question.
No, what might answer the question is in the negative. Has there ever been a moment where you've engaged with groups outside the art world where you've been troubled by the results yourself?
No, because I was, I would say, I was kind of very highly critical of people like the Hohenbüchler. Mm-hmm. The kind of prison, I got kind of like goosebumps, when I hear artists go into a prison or into a hospital, a mental institution, and then they produce artworks. I don't see art as therapy. I think we all have like many years of education, and we become professional by sitting on panels like that, have international exchanges, and then to go in and try to solve a problem. I think the artist's role in society is a different one from a social worker. We are not a sociologist. We have on one hand we have social tools, but we also have kind of formal tools. We have aesthetic tools, and to bring them together, that's so incredible. What Doc talked about, the kind of like It's Raining Men, then the kind of budgets, all this kind of bringing things together. That's also what Mark Dine told me, that based on kind of James Meyer's text, The Functional Site. That was the title of the 1994 essay that I asked him to write for a show that I curated or kind of organized for Kunsthalle Zurich, where exactly I invited 2 locals and 2 foreigners, the kind of perspective from within and then outside, looking into a situation that was Mark Dine, Tom Burr, Ursula Beeman, and myself about the infamous Needle Park, where thousands of heroin users would congregate in Zurich every day. So there we kind of occupied several locations, but we clearly said that we are not analyzing these situations. We are artists, but we of course use different sites where our work becomes visible, and then it can generate discussions.
Somebody else want to pick up the ethics question? Renata, perhaps, in relationship to... maybe this is not quite related to you, but I was struck when you mentioned the fact that I don't know, maybe people probably can't hear me, so I was struck by the fact that you talked about naming as a sort of transgressive act, which rang a bell with me anyway. The fact that you actually named Nagel or named Texte zur Kunst as a moment where people then felt, okay, this is very fine, but it goes too far. Or am I right in understanding it like that?
I think I think this maybe became clear in my talk also, that I'm very critical about the notion of community, and I also was at the time already. So to create a community and not have a critical stance towards it, which is also, I think, for example, in the term relational art, the idea there is some relation, but you don't ask what kind of relation. What's about the hierarchies? Who initiated the relation? Who organizes the relation, and so on? So I think it's very important to really question this positionalities and the way relations are organized. So I always think I would really more invest in struggle than in a harmonious idea of community. And so it's also, maybe I can also address another question which came up in relation to that, the question of success and failure again, because it struck me that in the beginning we were talking about failure, and then the success came as a dichotomous other half of it. And I'm not so sure if this was a good idea, because I think failure can have something very productive. And for example, in queer theory, failure is an important device to kind of bring breaks into norms, into a proper reproduction of norms and normalities. And another one which just came to my mind when we talked about it is forgetting as a term. So maybe this could all be also something productive I invested in a lot today. And the third by Judith Jack Halberstam. She works a lot with those terms, and the third one she uses is stupidity. Maybe we can think about that too.
Yeah, nice. If people can prepare their questions, I want to bring Sabet in and actually to slightly shift the discussion, because there's one thing you said almost as a throwaway line, and I'd like you to expand on it. You said that, I think, after 1995, so you posit 1995 as this kind of moment of change when the question of institutional critique comes to an end or in some way implodes or whatever happens to it, it transforms. And you said after that, you said something like, after 1995, it's maybe where life becomes more art-like. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah.
And I wonder if for me it was very striking. I wonder if you could expand on it a little bit, if you feel happy to do that.
Yeah, that was a question also of failure and success, which was addressed by Renate, that I wanted to take up this question whether there was a kind of social turn or a cultural turn, and I think it is very symptomatic that we all the time try to find out in what kind of fields we were then acting. And I think that is symptomatic that we have, on the one hand, this kind of pairing of the cultural and the political, and on the other hand, of the social and the ethical. And for me, there was, I don't know whether I said after 95 there was, the topos of life within the exhibitions, but what you could see, I think, from the very first moment on, that it was to bring human beings into the picture of the exhibition, to make them alive. That is something which strikes me and which lets me question whether this was about the social or whether this was about the political. I would say, but since I'm occupied with this discourse on biopolitical, that it is more about a political term in terms of making life itself as a productive source on the one hand, and on the other hand, on being the material of the exhibitions. If you look at the depictions and illustrations of those practices and projects at that time, you often find, and I saw it also very much in the French examples you have shown, that it was so significant to show people like working together, like communicating together. You hardly get a picture of a piece of exhibition or what it was in terms of object categories. And so therefore I would like to shift the discussion more on the field of the political and discuss it there and link it also to the question which this lady raised in the beginning, what is about the economy? And I see there is something we should really deepen, and we look more for what it was about. So it was more a question which I tried to raise than that I have a specific answer to this.
I think that's interesting. It reminds me, I was at a conference recently where a politician at the conference, I think, said something which struck me and maybe relates also to this, that because the economic questions, in a sense, are above the national or democratic political field now. They're simply solved at another level, which is either at the juridical legalistic one or simply through corporations negotiating with each other. That what's happened is the political sphere has basically determined that what are socio-economic problems are solved, in the political sense, through socio-cultural answers. So in other words, if you think about identity politics, if you think about the bigot and Mrs. Duffy issue of 2 days ago, this seems to me to be a good example where the question of the economic question, I mean, her question in essence was an economic one about her own status and relations with other people, is interpreted politically as a cultural statement. And I wonder whether this also has something to do with it, that in a sense the economic has become cultural through the ineffectiveness of democracy to deal with economic questions.
Can I give
Please.
A quick answer to that? That was the perspective or the question of my paper that I asked myself, why an exhibition or an exhibition project like Medium as Message, which at that time addressed the economic sphere or a new economy of the sign, of the immaterial production, later became then the framework and the subject of exhibitions like Money Nations. There did happen something during the 90s. And this is one point. And the other point is that have some problems also with Boltanski and Chapello by claiming that the artists are the avant-garde of the economy or the current political development, because I think it's much more complicated. And it is like trying to bring in a new idea of the avant-garde, by the same time not seeing that there is a kind of whole new set of politics of subjectivities and how to enable subjectivities to become productive in a much more wide range than only in the art field. I think it's a too narrow perspective on economy. That is my criticism on Boltanski and Chapello. And I would say, speaking from my perspective, it is those practices at that time really enabled me in a way very much to develop a kind of critical discourse. And I really profited from that, starting with the panel culture in the late 80s and the early 90s, which told us it's important what you have to say. Go and produce your discourse, and that is why I stand today here, and we reproduce exactly this economy, and it was something which enabled us. By the same time, we see very much how much we are symptom of this economy which goes to this kind of production. So I think we have to discuss it in that framework.
Just a question. Now that the productive moment, I experience the same thing. We will make our own discourse. We will make our own spaces. But now that, in a sense, the rhetorical or the critical, especially as it's organized around the social turn, is so much part of the commodification of work. I know this from my students. Mm-hmm. They feel they have to have a thesis position as undergraduates. 10 years ago, they felt they had to know a gallerist. Now they feel they have to know Bruno Latour and Jacques Rancière and have a sort of sensibility around a critical presentation of themselves as a commodity within this sort of critical aspect of our industry. How do we respond to that?
Yeah. I think I would totally agree that's about commodification, right. But I don't think that is the whole answer. It is even if we are not commodified. Exactly. It is even with the people who fails. Therefore, I'm a little bit against this dichotomy of failure and success, because even if we are not successful, you have to be productive. You have to do something out of your life, even it's not commodified, and you have to be part of it. So I think it's a little bit more complicated.
It's even worse if you're not successful. Huh? It doesn't make it better if you're not successful.
Yeah, and it's also about what's beyond the commodity in a sense, rather than resisting it. I think it seems to be to resist commodification seems to be a pointless desire. But is there something beyond it? It's more that question. I think that if you get to know Rancière, then do you, not personally perhaps, but in terms of his writing, then the gallerists you had to get to know personally. There are theorists you can just read. But I wonder if that does have an effect. Then I mean, not believing Jeffrey Deitch as the saviour, but Rancière as the saviour, must have an effect on the production of work. There must be a beyond commodification at that point, I would guess.
There is. You're right.
Quickly at my last contribution, it is, the question. Your question is part of the problem, because the beyond of commodification is the real life, and this is also part of the whole economy. And this is the answer normally, the counter logic of the art market has, and it is no question. It's part of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe there's some spaces in between there, but we'll see. We have to find out, maybe. I'd like to gather 2 or 3 new questions. I've got 3 in the far corners and 1 down here.
Well, I'm sorry, my English is very bad. I'm going to try. I will try to explain myself. I think that there's one thing that I don't agree. Boltanski and Chapello actually never talk about avant-garde. Artists as the avant-garde of new capitalism, new forms of production and organization of production. They never said that. And it's very important to point it out, because the main point They were analyzing all the literature of managing in the last 30 years, and they were saying actually they put the artist, I mean the work of the artist as a model in terms of the aleatory, the subjectivity, etc. That is all the time mentioned in this management literature. And all this comes from the economy of knowledge, which is one thing that is so important now in all the companies, all the economical issues, economical ambitions. And in that sense, it's true that they take artists as a model, but never as an avant-garde model. It takes a model because an artist is like the king of the subjectivism, something like that, and it's the reference for that, which actually it is true that all this is in correspondence. It appears and it happens at the same time. In the early 90s, it happens at the same time with this vocation of artists, this new ambition that is to do something else than objects. And this something else, which we never know what it is, because it is a new frontier, let's say. There could be so many things at the same time, is what the economy of knowledge is saying, that this aleatory way of production, etc., can reach new systems of economy. So that's the main problem, and the problem that Boltanski show up is that in this correspondence, and there is no critic of it. There is no critic of capitalism that on it. When we see the artist, using this reference of that what Boltanski was saying, for instance, or the literature of management, means one thing that is very important is that in all this there is so much confusion because there is no real critic of it. What is the thing that is separating the artistic activity or the economical activity? It is extremely complex issue. I agree with that. We cannot combine it all the time, and it is quite productive if we think on some things that come from outside of the art critic. For instance, Bruno Latour, which is much more useful to use it than Boltanski, for instance.
Thank you. Can I go to the other far corner, and then down here, and we'll take one more if there is one more. But there isn't, unless I'm missing. Yeah, there, I think in the corner. No? Okay, no, down here. Sorry, down. There's one down here with the hat. Thank you. Sorry to be so vulgar.
That's right. Okay, I kind of wanted to bring in a couple of points, really. One is that we're locating this as a discussion of art in the 90s and looking at the social turn of exhibitions from then. But actually, if you look at the 90s, the 1890s, the establishment of many public art spaces, particularly in this country, are predicated on exactly the same idea that art being taken into areas will bring social cohesion, will bring economic and social development. But what's maybe slightly different is that these aren't government initiatives. These are the initiatives of individual philanthropists. And so you get places like the Whitechapel being built around this time entirely with private money in order to improve the lives and to educate the working artisans of East London. And if you look at the rhetoric that was put forward for the building of these spaces, along with wash houses, there's actually a bathhouse very close to the Whitechapel which was built at the same time by the same philanthropist. The rhetoric is exactly equivalent to the rhetoric that is now used within political location of culture as a vehicle for social cohesion, a vehicle for education. Now, one thing that I would like to sort of perhaps bridge back to in this sense is that when we move the predominant economic value of art from private spheres, whether it has social meaning or just in terms of collecting, into public money, it seems, which was very prevalent in the 90s within the rhetoric of, again, British government, so certainly the late 90s, the idea of some kind of responsibility for that money, whether it's ethical or not, might be slightly different, but the responsibility to deliver something cohesive for that money must be raised, because as soon as the artist is entering into that system, if they are expecting some kind of privilege, then this social turn already fails. So I don't have a sort of answer myself about this, but I do see the sort of emphasis, perhaps, which might link up with the cultural turn, which was mentioned earlier, for artists to actually be delivering something in return for the financial support that they're receiving. And just as one other strand that seems to tie in here, for me at least, is the actual redundancy of the artist as a producer of imagery, or a producer of producer of visual culture in the face of mechanical reproduction. And I know it's a bit of a hoary old chestnut, but there is a problem that photography outstrips any of the artisan basis for the arts from 100 years ago. So the artists have to then reinvest themselves somewhere else. And I'm just curious about where positions from the panel would be on those.
Point. So we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'd like to take the other question. Thank you very much. Can we come down here? There was a question here? Yes.
Hello, I was just wondering, speaking from a point in time where Europe kind of extends very eastwards and southwards, today there seemed to be an absence of examples of artists and projects from that part, from southeastern Europe or Eastern Europe. And I was wondering whether the speakers could perhaps elaborate whether they think it's because in the 1990s that way of working, of artistic working, was limited in Europe to the western part.
Okay, that's a straightforward question. Sorry.
In Money Nation, you can clearly see, because many years later, then I visited the Lia and I went to Bucharest, Periovsky, which now they are everywhere. But basically, there was Marion von Ossen in Money Nation. You brought this up, right? Yes, these examples. There was a presence, a very early presence. Actually, I did not know at the time, of exactly that range, that expansion of Europe. But
it's actually really rare, because I was looking for these kind of similar projects. Like in Eastern Europe, you can't find them, and there's even though people like Pavel Altheimer are included in Sonsbeck, they do very kind of small, modest sort of interventions. And I was talking to Edith András, the Hungarian art historian, about this, and she said she had also noticed that there was a complete dearth of these projects. And we don't know, she was speculating, maybe this is a sort of a hangover state socialism, where collectivism is the dominant imposed ideal and norm, that as soon as you have the collapse of that in 89-90, artists just want to be are desperate to reclaim their individual subjectivity and to be working independently. That's all I've thought about it.
The DDR, the German Democratic Republic, Renate, you mentioned it in relationship to Trapp, that there were some discussions where the legacy of the DDR was in some way present.
I realized that only now, that there were struggles at the time, when I didn't have that in my mind still from that time. And also, I think that I know projects, for example, from Bulgaria, but maybe more of the second half of the 90s. But there were collective projects, also feminist collective projects. And I think it's also a question of research, maybe, or if our terms of what we conceive as an interesting artwork really match that projects. But I have to do more research there.
I mean, it's also the fact that there's this huge economic transition period, which is occupying, I think, people in those first 5 years of the 90s, certainly on a social level, that the economic transition, the transition economies, as they were called, and transition countries even, were...
But this is when Interpol is a really interesting example to look at, and both the catalogue and the book that was produced by Irwin dissecting this afterwards, because this was an attempt by a Russian curator and a Swedish curator to work together to produce a performative, process-based exhibition in which, much like the French ones, the artists would work together to produce work on site for this huge hangar-like exhibition space in Stockholm. And the tensions that ensued from that, from the Russians trying to impose a collectivist model of exhibition organisation onto mainly Nordic artists used to working in a kind of a singular authored tradition, and the friction that emerges from that is very tellingly explored in those two publications.
Can I come back just before we close to this question of in a sense, the artist as the service provider, the artist as service provider, and I think I'd like to just ask Christian to comment on this, because I think there is a move away from the service provider in the more recent present.
I think the move already took place in the mid-90s. I would see the relational aesthetic artists, even if they hardly can be put into a group, I would see them clearly as experience providers and not as service providers. I would see there. I would maybe draw a link there. I mean, there was a contract that Andrea had basically shown in a show at American Fine Arts, and then the first time that she got a job for this contract was actually Sabine Breitwies, and where she analyzed a kind of collection of Generali. But then that kind of service model became very quickly obsolete, because society moved on, and Harvard Business School, I mean, there's a lot of publications on the kind of experience economy, and I think I see that moment already in the mid-90s, and parallel to the relational aesthetics movement.
I have to close. I think one thing we've learned is that the history of the 90s hasn't been written yet, but that it will need to be. Otherwise, we'll have a big gap. So I hope that we'll return to this subject, and I hope that you'll also buy the After All books and discover from them what needs to be discovered after this process. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to the speakers.
Before you all go, could I just also like to add a round of thanks, particularly to Charles and again to Lucy Steeds at After All for organising this, and Eleanor Clayton here, and particularly, of course, to all the speakers for their contribution. So on behalf of Tate, thank you very much indeed. And before you leave, could I just flag up two conferences that are coming up that are adjacent and have links to this. On Friday the 14th of May, we've got a conference with a keynote with Bruno Latour on Beyond the Academy, the researchers' exhibition, where some of the aspects about process and the instrumentalisation of knowledge and research will come up as well. And then on Friday the 21st of May, we've got a conference on the contingency of curation with Susan Hiller and Andrea Phillips and others. So there'll be leaflets to pick up on the way out. But once again, thank you very much to all of you, and thank you to the speakers.